Jade Martinez sat hunched in seat 23 of Air France Flight 1847, her weathered face hidden behind oversized sunglasses and a worn baseball cap pulled low over graying hair. At 47 years old, she looked like thousands of other middle-aged women traveling economy class, tired, unremarkable, and invisible to fellow passengers who barely glanced at the woman clutching a faded canvas bag that contained everything she owned in the world. But appearances can be devastatingly deceptive. 7 years earlier, Jade Martinez had been Captain Jade Falcon Martinez, one of the most respected test pilots in the United States Air Force, with security clearances that granted her access to the nation's most advanced aviation technologies and a reputation for technical brilliance that had earned her assignments to the most challenging experimental aircraft programs. Her downfall had begun with what should have been her greatest professional achievement. In 2017, while conducting classified testing of new engine technologies for potential military applications, Jade had discovered a catastrophic design flaw in the Turbodine X7 engine series, a revolutionary new power plant that promised unprecedented fuel efficiency and reduced emissions for commercial aviation. The flaw was subtle but deadly. Under specific combinations of altitude, temperature, and loading conditions, the Turbodine X7's advanced composite turbine blades would develop microscopic fractures that propagated through the material in ways that normal inspection procedures couldn't detect. Over time, these fractures would weaken the blade until they failed catastrophically, causing uncontained engine explosions that could destroy aircraft and kill everyone aboard. Jade had documented the flaw meticulously, conducting hundreds of hours of testing that proved the Turbodine X7's fundamental design was fatally compromised. Her technical reports had been thorough, her analysis unassailable, and her recommendations clear. The engine should be redesigned from the ground up, regardless of the time and expense required to correct the problems. But the Turbodine X7 wasn't just another experimental engine. It was a centerpiece of a $47 billion program that represented the future of commercial aviation for Aérospatiale Turbine Systems, one of France's largest aerospace manufacturers. The company had already received orders for over 3,000 engines from airlines worldwide, and any delay in production would cost billions of dollars and potentially bankrupt the entire corporation. When Jade's reports reached senior military and corporate leadership, the response had been swift and devastating. Instead of addressing the technical problems she had identified, powerful forces within both the Air Force and Aerospatiale had chosen to attack her credibility, question her competence, and ultimately destroy her career rather than acknowledge that their revolutionary engine was a death trap waiting to kill innocent people. The character assassination had been systematic and ruthless. Jade's military record was retroactively questioned. Her test results were declared inconclusive by review boards that included aerospatial consultants, and she was subjected to psychological evaluations that suggested she was suffering from stress-related paranoia. Her security clearances were revoked, her access to test data was terminated, and she was eventually forced to resign from the Air Force under circumstances that made her unemployable in the aerospace industry. But the attacks hadn't stopped with her professional destruction. When Jade had attempted to take her concerns to aviation safety authorities, journalists, and congressional investigators, she had discovered that Aerospatiale's influence extended far beyond the aerospace industry. Key officials had financial ties to the corporation. Major media outlets depended on advertising revenue from aerospace companies, and politicians were reluctant to challenge an industry that provided jobs and campaign contributions. More ominously, Jade had begun receiving threats that suggested her continued efforts to expose the Turbodine X7's flaws were putting her physical safety at risk. Her apartment had been burglarized multiple times, her phone and email accounts had been hacked, and she had been followed by individuals who made no attempt to conceal their surveillance. The message was clear: abandon her crusade against the Turbodine X7, or face consequences that extended far beyond professional retaliation. Faced with escalating threats and no legal recourse, Jade had chosen survival over justice. She had disappeared from public view, adopted a new identity, and spent the last 7 years living in deliberate obscurity, working cash jobs, avoiding official documentation, and never staying in one place long enough to be tracked by the forces that had destroyed her previous life. The irony of her current situation wasn't lost on her. After 7 years of avoiding air travel to prevent any chance of encountering the engine she had tried to warn the world about, financial necessity had forced her to accept a job interview in Lyon that required flying on exactly the type of aircraft she had tried to keep out of the skies. As Flight 1847 climbed through 25,000 feet above the French countryside, Jade sat rigid in her economy seat, hyper-aware of every sound and vibration from the Turbodine X7 engines that powered their Airbus A320. Trained, it could distinguish the subtle acoustic signatures that indicated normal engine operation from the barely perceptible changes that might signal developing problems. For the first hour of the flight, the engines had performed flawlessly, producing the smooth, consistent power that had made the Turbodine X7 popular with airlines seeking fuel efficiency and reduced maintenance costs. But as they reached cruising altitude and the engines settled into their long-term operating parameters, Jade began to detect something that made her blood run cold. It was a barely perceptible change in the harmonic frequency of the right engine, not the kind of obvious mechanical problem that would trigger crew alerts or passenger concern, but a subtle alteration in the acoustic signature that suggested the microscopic fractures she had discovered 7 years earlier were finally beginning to propagate through the turbine blades. The engine was still operating normally by all conventional measures, but Jade's specialized knowledge told her that they were witnessing the early stages of the catastrophic failure mode she had spent years trying to warn people about. The fractures were spreading, the turbine blades were weakening, and sometime within the next 30 to 60 minutes, engine number 2 was going to explode with enough force to potentially bring down the entire aircraft. Jade found herself facing an impossible choice. She could remain silent, hoping that her assessment was wrong and that the engine would continue operating safely until they reached Lyon. Or she could speak up, knowing that her warnings would likely be dismissed as the ravings of a disturbed passenger, and that revealing her knowledge might expose her to the same forces that had destroyed her life 7 years earlier. As the subtle engine vibrations continued to worsen and Jade's technical analysis confirmed her worst fears about the developing catastrophe, she realized that 267 innocent people were about to pay the ultimate price for the corporate greed and institutional cowardice that had suppressed her warnings about the Turbodine X7's deadly flaws. At 3:47 p.m. Central European Time, as Air France Flight 1847 cruised at 37,000 feet over the Burgundy region of France, Jade Martinez pressed her call button with trembling hands that reflected not fear, but the terrible certainty of someone who understood exactly what was about to happen to everyone aboard their aircraft. The flight attendant who responded was Celeste Dubois, a professional woman in her 30s who had been working commercial aviation for 8 years and prided herself on her ability to handle passenger concerns with calm efficiency. When she saw the disheveled woman in 23 raising her hand with obvious urgency, Celeste assumed she was dealing with routine passenger anxiety or perhaps a medical issue. "Madam, how may I help you?" Celeste asked in accented English, noting that the passenger appeared to be American and seemed agitated despite her attempt to maintain composure. Jade's response was delivered with a kind of technical precision that her military training had ingrained, but her appearance in economy class seat made it difficult for Celeste to take her seriously as a credible source of technical information about aircraft operations. "Mademoiselle, I need to speak with the captain immediately about a serious engine problem," Jade said, her voice carrying authority despite her worn appearance. "The right engine is developing turbine blade fractures that are going to cause catastrophic failure within the next 30 to 60 minutes. This is not passenger anxiety. This is an engineering assessment based on acoustic analysis that indicates imminent mechanical failure." Celeste's training had taught her to handle passenger concerns professionally while avoiding unnecessary crew distraction during normal flight operations. The woman's claim about engine problems was a kind of technical assertion that passengers sometimes made based on normal aircraft sound that seemed unusual to untrained ears. "Madam, I understand your concern, but our pilots are monitoring all aircraft systems and will be aware of any mechanical problems," Celeste replied with a kind of polite reassurance that airlines train their cabin crews to provide. "The sounds you are hearing are normal engine operations. Perhaps I can offer you something to help you relax during the remainder of our flight." But Jade had anticipated this response and was prepared with specific technical information that her years of test pilot experience had taught her to use when communicating critical safety information to aviation professionals who might be skeptical of unconventional sources. "Mademoiselle, the acoustic signature I'm detecting indicates stage 3 and stage 4 turbine blade resonance in the 847 Hz frequency range," Jade continued with clinical precision. "This is consistent with microscopic fracture propagation in Turbodine X7 composite blade assemblies operating at high-altitude cruise conditions. The engine monitoring systems won't detect this condition until the fractures reach critical propagation velocity, which will be approximately 15 seconds before catastrophic failure occurs. Celeste stared at the tired-looking woman who had just used technical terminology that was far beyond anything a normal passenger should understand. The specific references to engine components, frequency analysis, and failure mode suggested knowledge that couldn't be explained by casual guessing or passenger anxiety. "Madam, how do you know about aircraft engine systems?" Celeste asked, her professional skepticism beginning to compete with recognition that this passenger was demonstrating expertise that demanded more serious consideration. Jade's answer revealed both her qualifications and the tragic circumstances that had brought her to this moment. "I'm Captain Jade Martinez, former U.S. Air Force test pilot. Course sign Falcon. 7 years ago, I discovered the exact failure mode that your right engine is currently experiencing during classified testing of Turbodine X7 systems. I tried to warn people about this problem, but I was discredited and silenced by corporate interests that didn't want the truth to interfere with their profits." The mention of military aviation background and specific technical knowledge about their aircraft's engines gave Celeste pause, but the woman's claims about being a former Air Force officer seemed inconsistent with her appearance and her presence in economy class seating. "Madam, if you have military aviation experience, why are you traveling in economy class, and why haven't you contacted the crew through normal channels?" Celeste asked, her confusion evident as she tried to reconcile the technical knowledge the passenger was displaying with her unconventional circumstances. Jade's response revealed the personal cost of her attempts to expose the Turbodine X7's flaws and the reasons why she had been living in obscurity for 7 years. "Because when I tried to warn people about this problem 7 years ago, powerful forces destroyed my career, my reputation, and my life. I've been hiding ever since, working menial jobs and avoiding any contact with the aviation industry. But I can't stay silent when I know that everyone on this aircraft is about to die because of the same corporate cover-up that ruined my life." Before Celeste could respond, Flight 1847 was suddenly rocked by violent vibrations that sent passengers' belongings flying and caused several people to cry out in alarm. The right engine had just experienced what Jade recognized as a minor containment event, a partial failure of turbine blades that hadn't yet progressed to full catastrophic explosion, but indicated that complete engine destruction was imminent. "That was Stage 4 blade liberation," Jade said with grim certainty as the aircraft shuddered around them. "You have maybe 10 minutes before the remaining blade fragments cause complete engine failure. The pilots need to execute emergency shutdown procedures immediately, and they need to prepare for the possibility that blade fragments have already damaged other aircraft systems." Celeste found herself staring at a passenger who had accurately predicted an engine problem that the flight crew was only now beginning to recognize through their instrument displays. The woman's technical assessment had been proven correct by events, and her obvious knowledge of engine failure mode suggested credibility that couldn't be dismissed despite her unconventional appearance. "Madam Martinez, what do you recommend we do?" Celeste asked, her professional training overriding her confusion about how to handle a situation that was outside normal passenger service procedures. Jade's response was immediate and comprehensive, drawing on years of experience with aircraft emergencies and her intimate knowledge of the specific failure modes that affected Turbodine X7 engines. "First, you need to convince the captain to shut down the right engine immediately before the remaining turbine blades fail completely. Second, you need to prepare the cabin for emergency landing procedures, because this aircraft is going to lose significant performance capability when the engine fails. Third, you need to be ready for the possibility that I'll need to assist with flight operations if the engine failure has damaged systems that the pilots can't manage with normal procedures." As Flight 1847 continued to shudder with increasing violence and warning light began illuminating in the cockpit, Celeste realized that the disheveled woman in economy class might be the only person aboard their aircraft who truly understood what they were facing and how to survive it. At 3:47 p.m. Central European Time, as Air France Flight 1847 cruised at 37,000 feet over the Burgundy region of France, Jade Martinez pressed her call button with trembling hands that reflected not fear, but the terrible certainty of someone who understood exactly what was about to happen to everyone aboard their aircraft. The flight attendant who responded was Celeste Dubois, a professional woman in her 30s who had been working commercial aviation for 8 years and prided herself on her ability to handle passenger concerns with calm efficiency. When she saw the disheveled woman in 23 raising her hand with obvious urgency, Celeste assumed she was dealing with routine passenger anxiety or perhaps a medical issue. "Madam, how may I help you?" Celeste asked in accented English, noting that the passenger appeared to be American and seemed agitated despite her attempt to maintain composure. Jade's response was delivered with a kind of technical precision that her military training had ingrained, but her appearance in economy class seat made it difficult for Celeste to take her seriously as a credible source of technical information about aircraft operations. "Mademoiselle, I need to speak with the captain immediately about a serious engine problem," Jade said, her voice carrying authority despite her worn appearance. "The right engine is developing turbine blade fractures that are going to cause catastrophic failure within the next 30 to 60 minutes. This is not passenger anxiety. This is an engineering assessment based on acoustic analysis that indicates imminent mechanical failure." Celeste's training had taught her to handle passenger concerns professionally while avoiding unnecessary crew distraction during normal flight operations. The woman's claim about engine problems was a kind of technical assertion that passengers sometimes made based on normal aircraft sounds that seemed unusual to untrained ears. "Madam, I understand your concern, but our pilots are monitoring all aircraft systems and would be aware of any mechanical problems," Celeste replied with a kind of polite reassurance that airlines train their cabin crews to provide. "The sounds you are hearing are normal engine operations. Perhaps I can offer you something to help you relax during the remainder of our flight." But Jade had anticipated this response and was prepared with specific technical information that her years of test pilot experience had taught her to use when communicating critical safety information to aviation professionals who might be skeptical of unconventional sources. "Mademoiselle, the acoustic signature I'm detecting indicates stage 3 and stage 4 turbine blade resonance in the 847 Hz frequency range," Jade continued with clinical precision. "This is consistent with microscopic fracture propagation in Turbodine X7 composite blade assemblies operating at high-altitude cruise conditions. The engine monitoring systems won't detect this condition until the fractures reach critical propagation velocity, which will be approximately 15 seconds before catastrophic failure occurs." Celeste stared at the tired-looking woman who had just used technical terminology that was far beyond anything a normal passenger should understand. The specific references to engine components, frequency analysis, and failure mode suggested knowledge that couldn't be explained by casual guessing or passenger anxiety. "Madam, how do you know about aircraft engine systems?" Celeste asked, her professional skepticism beginning to compete with recognition that this passenger was demonstrating expertise that demanded more serious consideration. Jade's answer revealed both her qualifications and the tragic circumstances that had brought her to this moment. "I'm Captain Jade Martinez, former U.S. Air Force test pilot, call sign Falcon. 7 years ago, I discovered the exact failure mode that your right engine is currently experiencing during classified testing of Turbodine X7 systems. I tried to warn people about this problem, but I was discredited and silenced by corporate interests that didn't want the truth to interfere with their profits." The mention of military aviation background and specific technical knowledge about their aircraft's engines gave Celeste pause, but the woman's claims about being a former Air Force officer seemed inconsistent with her appearance and her presence in economy class seating. "Madam, if you have military aviation experience, why are you traveling in economy class, and why haven't you contacted the crew through normal channels?" Celeste asked, her confusion evident as she tried to reconcile the technical knowledge the passenger was displaying with her unconventional circumstances. Jade's response revealed the personal cost of her attempts to expose the Turbodine X7's flaws and the reasons why she had been living in obscurity for 7 years. "Because when I tried to warn people about this problem 7 years ago, powerful forces destroyed my career, my reputation, and my life. I've been hiding ever since, working menial jobs and avoiding any contact with the aviation industry. But I can't stay silent when I know that everyone on this aircraft is about to die because of the same corporate cover-up that ruined my life." Before Celeste could respond, Flight 1847 was suddenly rocked by violent vibrations that sent passengers' belongings flying and caused several people to cry out in alarm. The right engine had just experienced what Jade recognized as a minor containment event, a partial failure of turbine blades that hadn't yet progressed to full catastrophic explosion, but indicated that complete engine destruction was imminent. "That was stage 4 blade liberation," Jade said with grim certainty as the aircraft shuttered around them. "You have maybe 10 minutes before the remaining blade fragments cause complete engine failure." The pilots need to execute emergency shutdown procedures immediately, and they need to prepare for the possibility that blade fragments have already damaged other aircraft systems. Celeste found herself staring at a passenger who had accurately predicted an engine problem that the flight crew was only now beginning to recognize through their instrument displays. The woman's technical assessment had been proven correct by events, and her obvious knowledge of engine failure mode suggested credibility that couldn't be dismissed despite her unconventional appearance. "Madam Martinez, what do you recommend we do?" Celeste asked, her professional training overriding her confusion about how to handle a situation that was outside normal passenger service procedures. Jade's response was immediate and comprehensive, drawing on years of experience with aircraft emergencies and her intimate knowledge of the specific failure modes that affected Turbodine X7 engines. First, you need to convince the captain to shut down the right engine immediately before the remaining turbine blades fail completely. Second, you need to prepare the cabin for emergency landing procedures, because this aircraft is going to lose significant performance capability when the engine fails. Third, you need to be ready for the possibility that I'll need to assist with flight operations if the engine failure has damaged systems that the pilots can't manage with normal procedures. As Flight 1847 continued to shudder with increasing violence and warning lights began illuminating in the cockpit, Celeste realized that the disheveled woman in economy class might be the only person aboard their aircraft who truly understood what they were facing and how to survive it. Open Book Part 3. The Explosion. 5,289 character. At 4:23 p.m. Central European Time, Jade Martinez's worst predictions were realized in the most violent and terrifying way possible. The right engine of Flight 1847 experienced what aviation investigators would later classify as an uncontained catastrophic failure, the complete destruction of the Turbodine X7's turbine assembly in an explosion so powerful that it sent metal fragments through the engine casing and into critical aircraft systems. The explosion was both sudden and devastating. Passengers throughout the cabin were thrown against their restraints as the aircraft was rocked by forces that seemed powerful enough to tear the plane apart. The sound was indescribable, a combination of mechanical destruction, rushing air, and structural stress that created a cacophony of terror that would haunt survivors for years afterward. But for Jade Martinez, the explosion wasn't a surprise. It was the inevitable culmination of 7 years of suppressed warnings about a design flaw that should never have been allowed into commercial service. As other passengers screamed in panic and flight attendants struggled to maintain their footing in the violently shaking cabin, Jade remained calm with a controlled composure that military training had ingrained in her for dealing with life-threatening emergencies. Engine fragments have damaged the hydraulic systems and possibly the flight controls. Jade called out to Celeste, who was fighting to maintain communication with the cockpit while managing passenger panic. The pilots are going to lose normal control authority, and they are going to need guidance on how to fly this aircraft with degraded systems. In the cockpit, Captain Unremarkable and First Officer Sylvie Laurent were dealing with a cascade of system failures that was overwhelming their ability to maintain controlled flight. The engine explosion had severed 2 of 3 hydraulic systems, damaged multiple flight control surfaces, and created asymmetric thrust conditions that were making the aircraft nearly uncontrollable using standard flying techniques. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Captain Moreau transmitted to Lyon Air Traffic Control, his voice tight with strain as he fought to maintain altitude and heading despite the aircraft's severely compromised condition. Air France 1847. We have experienced uncontained engine failure with multiple system damage. Requesting immediate clearance to nearest suitable airport and emergency services standing by. The response from Lyon Control was immediate and professional, but the technical support they could provide was limited to basic navigation guidance and emergency service coordination. What Captain Moreau needed was someone with expertise in flying damaged aircraft under conditions that weren't covered in standard airline training procedures. Celeste, remembering Jade's claims about military test pilot experience and her accurate prediction of the engine failure, made a decision that was unprecedented in her 8 years of commercial aviation service. Captain Moreau, I have a passenger who claims to be a former Air Force test pilot. She predicted this engine failure and says she has experience with damaged aircraft emergency procedures. Should I ask her to come to the cockpit? Captain Moreau's initial reaction was skepticism about accepting technical advice from a passenger, but the severity of their situation was beyond anything his commercial aviation training had prepared him to handle. The aircraft was becoming increasingly difficult to control, and standard emergency procedures weren't providing adequate guidance for managing the multiple system failures they were experiencing. Bring her up, Moreau decided, recognizing that any source of relevant expertise might be crucial for saving everyone aboard. If she has experience with damaged aircraft, we need all the help we can get. Jade's walk from seat 23 to the cockpit was the longest journey of her life, not because of the physical distance, but because it represented her return to the aviation world that had betrayed and destroyed her 7 years earlier. As she entered the flight deck and saw the array of warning lights and system failure indications that were overwhelming the instrument panels, she felt the familiar combination of technical challenge and life-or-death responsibility that had defined her test pilot career. Captain Moreau, I'm Jade Martinez, former U.S. Air Force test pilot. Call sign Falcon, she said with a kind of military precision that immediately commanded attention despite her civilian appearance. I have extensive experience with Turbodine X7 engine failures and emergency procedures for flying aircraft with multiple system damage. Captain Moreau looked at the woman whose disheveled appearance seemed inconsistent with claims about military aviation experience, but her obvious familiarity with cockpit operations and her accurate prediction of their engine failure suggested credibility that couldn't be dismissed. Captain Martinez, we've lost 2 hydraulic systems. The right engine is completely destroyed, and we're having difficulty maintaining control, Moreau explained rapidly. Our flight controls are responding poorly, and standard emergency procedures don't seem adequate for the damage we sustained. Jade's assessment was immediate and comprehensive, drawing on years of experience with aircraft emergencies and her intimate knowledge of how Turbodine X7 failures affected other aircraft systems. Captain, the engine explosion has created fragment damage that extends far beyond the power plant itself. You're dealing with asymmetric thrust, reduced hydraulic pressure, and probably compromised flight control effectiveness. You need to forget standard airline procedures and fly this aircraft like a test pilot dealing with unknown flight characteristics. She moved to the flight control displays, studying the data with the kind of systematic analysis that test pilot training had developed. The key is understanding that this aircraft no longer behaves like a normal Airbus A320. You need to use larger control inputs, accept reduced response times, and plan for approach procedures that account for degraded performance in every flight regime. What Jade was describing represented a fundamental departure from the standardized procedures that airline training emphasized, but Captain Moreau was beginning to understand that their situation required techniques that weren't taught in commercial aviation programs. What specific procedures do you recommend? Moreau asked, his decision to trust this unconventional advisor reflecting both desperation and recognition that her technical knowledge was proving accurate in every detail. Jade's response would guide them through the most challenging emergency landing attempt in Air France's history, using techniques that combined military test pilot experience with a tragic understanding of how corporate negligence had created the crisis they were now fighting to survive. Standing in the cockpit of the severely damaged Air France A320, Jade Martinez found herself confronting not just a technical emergency, but also the psychological demons that had haunted her for 7 years. The engine failure she had predicted was unfolding exactly as her suppressed research had indicated, and now she had to use that same knowledge to save the lives of people who were victims of the same corporate cover-up that had destroyed her career. Captain Moreau, the first thing you need to understand is that your aircraft's flight characteristics have been fundamentally altered, Jade began, her voice carrying the calm authority that test pilot training had ingrained during countless emergency simulations. The Turbodine X7 failure mode creates specific types of damage that standard emergency procedures don't account for. You're not flying a damaged A320, you're flying an aircraft with completely new and unpredictable performance parameters. She moved to the flight control displays, pointing to specific readings that indicated the extent of the system damage they were dealing with. The engine explosion has severed hydraulic lines that affect not just primary flight controls, but also secondary systems like landing gear, wheel brakes, and cabin pressurization. You need to assume that every system connected to the right side of the aircraft has been compromised. Captain Moreau and First Officer Laurent were discovering that Jade's assessment was proving accurate as they attempted to execute standard emergency procedures. The aircraft wasn't responding to control inputs the way their training had taught them to expect, and multiple systems were showing degraded performance that made normal approach procedures impossible. What specific flight characteristics should we expect? Lauren asked, her professional curiosity overriding the natural skepticism that pilots feel about accepting technical guidance from non-crew sources. Jade's response drew on her extensive experience with damaged aircraft and a detailed knowledge of how Turbodine X7 failures affected overall aircraft performance. You'll find that the aircraft wants to roll right because of the asymmetric thrust and damaged flight controls. Control response will be sluggish and unpredictable, especially at low speeds. Most critically, your landing approach will require significantly higher approach speeds and longer runways than standard procedures specify. She outlined emergency landing techniques that combine military test pilot procedures with adaptations for the specific damage patterns that Turbodine X7 failures created. You need to plan for a high-energy approach that maintained control authority until touchdown, followed by extended rollout with manual braking systems if the normal wheel brakes have been compromised by hydraulic damage. As Flight 1847 began its emergency descent toward Lyon-Saint-Exupéry Airport, Jade provided continuous guidance on control techniques that were outside standard airline training but perfectly suited to their aircraft's condition. Her instructions were proving more effective than the emergency checklist that had been developed for normal equipment failures rather than the catastrophic damage they were actually experiencing. The approach speed needs to be at least 20 knots above normal, Jade instructed as they descended through 15,000 feet. The damaged flight controls won't provide adequate response at standard speeds, and you'll lose the ability to execute go-around procedures if the first approach attempt isn't successful. Captain Moreau found himself implementing flying techniques that challenged everything his commercial aviation training had taught him about proper procedures, but which seemed perfectly matched to their aircraft's actual condition and limitations. Captain Martinez, these procedures are completely outside airline standards. How do you know they'll work without specific damage? Jade's response revealed the tragic irony of their situation and the personal cost of the corporate cover-up that had brought them to this crisis. Because I spent 2 years testing damaged Turbodine X7 installations and documenting exactly these failure modes. I know how these engines fail, what damage they cause to other aircraft systems, and what emergency procedures are needed to safely land aircraft that have experienced this type of catastrophic failure. She continued with details that demonstrated both the technical expertise and the scope of the cover-up that had suppressed her warnings. Aérospatiale knew about these failure modes 7 years ago when I submitted my test reports. They knew that Turbodine X7 engines would eventually kill people, but they chose to hide the evidence rather than fix the problems. Every person aboard this aircraft is a victim of corporate greed that put profits ahead of human lives. As Flight 1847 continued its emergency approach with Jade's guidance proving essential for maintaining control of the severely damaged aircraft, Captain Moreau began to understand that they were dealing with more than just mechanical failure. They were confronting the consequences of institutional corruption that had prioritized financial considerations over aviation safety. Why didn't the aviation authorities investigate your warnings? Lauren asked, her question reflecting growing recognition that their emergency was a result of preventable corporate negligence rather than unforeseeable mechanical failure. Jade's answer revealed the systemic failures that had enabled the Turbodine X7 cover-up and prevented her warnings from reaching the people who could have protected innocent lives. Because Aérospatiale had influence over the regulators, the politicians, and the media outlets that should have been investigating safety concerns. When you're fighting corporate interests worth billions of dollars, individual whistleblowers don't have much chance of being heard. As they passed through 5,000 feet on final approach to Lyon Airport, Jade continued providing specific technical guidance that was proving crucial for managing their damaged aircraft's unpredictable behavior. But she was also documenting everything they were experiencing, knowing that this emergency would provide the evidence needed to finally expose the Turbodine X7 cover-up and prevent other aircraft from suffering the same catastrophic failure. Captain, after we land, and we will land safely using these procedures, I'm going to need your support in presenting evidence about why this engine failure occurred and why it could have been prevented, Jade said as they descended toward the runway. This crash is a proof that corporate corruption in aviation safety regulation can kill innocent people, and we have a responsibility to make sure it never happens again. The emergency landing of Flight 1847 would prove to be just the beginning of Jade Martinez's fight for aviation safety and corporate accountability, a battle that would finally vindicate her suppressed warnings and transform how the world understood the relationship between corporate profits and public safety. At 5:47 p.m. Central European Time, Air France Flight 1847 appeared on final approach to runway 07R at Lyon-Saint-Exupéry Airport, with emergency vehicles positioned along the entire length of the landing strip and medical teams standing by for what aviation authorities expected could be one of the most challenging emergency landings in French commercial aviation history. Captain Henri, following Jade Martinez's unconventional guidance, was executing an approach profile that departed significantly from standard airline procedures but seemed perfectly matched to the aircraft's severely compromised condition. The approach was faster and steeper than normal operations, using excess energy to maintain control authority despite the degraded flight control systems that made precision flying nearly impossible. Maintain 165 knots until runway threshold, Jade instructed from a position behind the pilot's seat, her voice carrying the calm confidence that came from extensive experience with damaged aircraft emergency procedures. Don't try to execute a precision approach. Focus on energy management and positive aircraft control. The runway is long enough to handle the extended rollout you'll need with compromised braking systems. First Officer Sylvie Laurent was monitoring engine parameters and system status while coordinating with air traffic control to ensure that emergency services were properly positioned for their unconventional landing profile. Lyon Tower, Air France 1847 executing non-standard approach procedures due to extensive aircraft damage. Planning high-energy touchdown with extended rollout distance. The response from Lyon Tower reflected both professional support and obvious concern about the unusual approach that Flight 1847 was executing. Air France 1847, emergency services are in position. Runway 07R is cleared for emergency landing with extended rollout area. Wind is calm, visibility unlimited. You are cleared to land. As the aircraft crossed the runway threshold at speeds that would normally be considered excessive for a commercial airliner, Captain Moreau felt the kind of precise control that Jade's guidance had made possible despite their aircraft's extensive damage. The techniques she had recommended were proving more effective than standard emergency procedures for managing an aircraft whose performance characteristics had been fundamentally altered by catastrophic engine failure. The touchdown was firm but controlled, with the aircraft settling onto the runway with positive contact that indicated successful energy management despite the challenging conditions. Moreau immediately deployed speed brakes and began applying emergency braking procedures while maintaining directional control, despite the asymmetric forces created by their single-engine condition and damaged flight systems. Outstanding execution, Jade said as Flight 1847 decelerated along the runway, surrounded by emergency vehicles but requiring no immediate rescue intervention. Your adaptation to non-standard procedures saved everyone aboard this aircraft. The emergency is over, but our work is just beginning. As the aircraft came to a complete stop and evacuation procedures began, all 267 passengers and crew members exited safely without serious injuries related to the emergency landing. The successful outcome was a testament to both the flight crew's skill and Jade's expertise in managing the specific type of catastrophic failure that the Turbodine X7's design flaws had created. But even as passengers celebrated their survival and emergency responders confirmed that no one had been seriously injured, Jade Martinez was already preparing for the next phase of a long-delayed fight against the corporate corruption that had nearly killed everyone aboard Flight 1847. Within hours of the emergency landing, Jade found herself in a conference room at Lyon Airport, speaking with accident investigators, aviation safety officials, and media representatives who were beginning to understand that the engine failure wasn't just a mechanical accident. It was the inevitable result of suppressed safety warnings and corporate cover-ups that had put profits ahead of human lives. This engine failure was entirely predictable and completely preventable, Jade told the investigators with a kind of technical precision that came from years of detailed documentation. 7 years ago, I submitted comprehensive test reports that proved Turbodine X7 engines would eventually experience exactly this type of catastrophic failure. Those reports were suppressed by corporate interests that didn't want safety concerns to interfere with their multi-billion-dollar sales programs. The lead investigator, Inspector Marie Rousseau from the French Bureau of Inquiry and Analysis for Civil Aviation Safety, had reviewed Jade's military records and confirmed her credentials as a former test pilot with extensive experience in engine failure analysis. Captain Martinez, do you still have access to the technical documentation that supports your claims about the Turbodine X7's design flaws? Jade's response revealed both the scope of her preparation for this moment and the personal cost of a 7-year exile from aviation. I've spent 7 years collecting evidence and documentation about the Turbodine X7 cover-up, while living in hiding from people who destroyed my career. I have test data, internal corporate communications, regulatory correspondence, and technical analysis that proves Aérospatiale knew their engines were defective and chose to hide the evidence rather than fix the problems. The media attention generated by Flight 1847's emergency landing and Jade's revelations about suppressed safety warnings created international pressure for comprehensive investigation of the Turbodine X7 program and the regulatory failures that had allowed defective engines to remain in commercial service. Captain Moreau and First Officer Laurent, whose lives had been saved by Jade's expertise, became powerful advocates for her credibility and the importance of her safety warnings. Captain Martinez's guidance was the only reason we were able to safely land our aircraft, Moreau told investigators. Her technical knowledge was more comprehensive than anything in our emergency procedures, and her predictions about the engine failure were completely accurate. As investigators began examining the wreckage of Flight 1847's destroyed engine and comparing the failure patterns to Jade's 7-year-old test reports, it became clear that her warnings had been not just accurate, but prophetic in their detailed prediction of exactly how and why Turbodine X7 engines would eventually kill people. The successful emergency landing had provided more than just survival for 267 people. It had created the platform and evidence that would finally allow Jade Martinez to expose the corporate corruption that had nearly cost hundreds of lives and had definitely destroyed her own career in the process of protecting corporate profits over public safety. 6 months after the emergency landing of Air France Flight 1847, Jade Martinez stood before the European Parliament's Aviation Safety Committee in Strasbourg, no longer the exhausted woman in economy class who had been dismissed as a disturbed passenger. Dressed in a professional suit and speaking with the authority of someone whose warnings had been vindicated by events, she was presenting evidence that would fundamentally change how the world understood corporate responsibility in aviation safety. The investigation of Flight 1847's engine failure had confirmed every aspect of Jade's suppressed warnings about the Turbodine X7's design flaws. More devastating for Aérospatiale Turbine Systems, the investigation had also uncovered the systematic cover-up that had prevented her safety concerns from reaching regulatory authorities, airlines, and the flying public. Honorable members, Jade began her testimony. What happened aboard Flight 1847 was not an accident. It was the inevitable result of corporate decisions that prioritized profit over human life. Aérospatiale knew that their Turbodine X7 engines would eventually kill people, and they chose to suppress that knowledge rather than accept the financial cost of fixing their defective product. The evidence that Jade presented was overwhelming in its scope and devastating in its implications. Internal corporate documents revealed that Aérospatiale executives had known about the turbine blade fracture problem for years, but had calculated that settling wrongful death lawsuits would be cheaper than redesigning their engines. Regulatory correspondence showed that aviation authorities had been influenced by corporate lobbying to minimize safety concerns that might affect industry profits. Most damning was the discovery that Flight 1847 wasn't the first Turbodine X7 failure. It was simply the first failure where someone with the technical knowledge to understand and document what was happening had been aboard the aircraft to provide evidence. 3 other aircraft have experienced similar engine failures over the past 2 years. Jade testified, presenting crash investigation reports that had been classified as pilot error or unknown mechanical failure despite evidence patterns that matched the Turbodine X7 failure mode she had originally documented. Those crashes killed 847 people whose deaths could have been prevented if my original warnings had been investigated rather than suppressed. The parliamentary hearings generated international media attention that created irresistible pressure for criminal prosecution of corporate executives who had participated in the cover-up. More immediately, aviation authorities in Europe, the United States, and Asia ordered immediate grounding of all aircraft equipped with Turbodine X7 engines pending comprehensive safety inspections and mandatory design modifications. But Jade's vindication extended beyond just aviation safety reform. Her case became a catalyst for broader legislative changes designed to protect whistleblowers who attempted to expose corporate misconduct that endangered public safety. The Martinez Act, passed by the European Union and subsequently adopted by the United States, created legal protections and financial support for individuals who risk their careers to expose safety violations by corporations. Captain Henri Moreau and First Officer Sylvie Laurent, whose lives had been saved by Jade's expertise during the Flight 1847 emergency, became vocal advocates for her recognition and the importance of protecting whistleblowers in safety-critical industries. Captain Martinez didn't just save our lives during the emergency. Moreau testified before the Aviation Safety Committee. She spent 7 years trying to save the lives of everyone who would ever fly on aircraft equipped with defective engines. The people who suppress her warnings are responsible for every death that could have been prevented if her evidence had been properly investigated. The financial consequences for Aérospatiale were catastrophic. The company faced billions of dollars in criminal fines, civil lawsuits, and the cost of redesigning and replacing every Turbodine X7 engine in commercial service. Several senior executives were convicted of criminal negligence and sentenced to prison terms that sent a clear message about corporate accountability for safety violations. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural rather than legal. Jade's case demonstrated that corporate power wasn't absolute, that individual whistleblowers could ultimately prevail against even the most powerful interests when they possess courage, evidence, and the support of people whose lives have been directly affected by corporate misconduct. The recognition that Jade received included restoration of a military rank and benefits, financial compensation for 7 years of exile and persecution, and appointment to the newly created European Aviation Safety Authority as Director of Whistleblower Protection and Corporate Accountability. My goal was never personal vindication, Jade explained during her acceptance speech for the International Aviation Safety Award. My goal was preventing the deaths of innocent people by ensuring that safety concerns could be raised and investigated without fear of retaliation. What happened aboard Flight 1847 proved that corporate corruption in safety regulation can kill people, but it also proved that the truth eventually emerges when people have the courage to keep speaking even when powerful forces want them to remain silent. The Turbodine X7 scandal became a watershed moment in aviation safety regulation, leading to fundamental changes in how safety concerns were investigated, how whistleblowers are protected, and how corporate executives were held accountable for decisions that affected public safety. 3 years after the Flight 1847 emergency, Jade Martinez received a letter from a young aviation engineer who had read about her case and been inspired to report safety concerns at her own company despite pressure from management to remain silent. The letter concluded with words that captured the lasting impact of Jade's courage. Thank you for showing us that speaking truth to power isn't just about individual conscience. It's about protecting innocent people from corporate decisions that value profits more than human life. The memorial erected at Lyon-Saint-Exupéry Airport honoring the successful emergency landing of Flight 1847 bears an inscription that reflects the broader significance of Jade's fight. In recognition of the truth that courage sometimes means speaking when others want you to be silent, and that the most important victories are won not on battlefields, but in the hearts and minds of people who choose justice over comfort. As Jade established new programs to protect and support whistleblowers in safety-critical industries, she carried with her the knowledge that her 7 years of exile and persecution had ultimately served a purpose greater than personal vindication. She had proven that individual courage could challenge corporate power, that suppressed truth would eventually emerge, and that the voices of those who fight for public safety would ultimately be heard even when powerful forces tried to silence them. Sometimes justice requires not just speaking truth to power, but persisting in that truth even when the personal cost seems unbearable. Sometimes the most important battles are fought by people who seem powerless against overwhelming odds, and sometimes victory comes not from defeating enemies, but from protecting innocent people who never knew they were in danger. This story reminds us of the truth as power that corporate money and political influence cannot ultimately suppress, and that the courage to speak up for public safety is one of the most important forms of heroism our world needs. Jade's journey from silenced whistleblower to vindicated champion of aviation safety demonstrates that persistence and courage can ultimately overcome even the most powerful forms of institutional corruption. Sometimes the most important voices belong to those the world has tried to silence, and sometimes justice delayed is not justice denied. It's justice that arrives exactly when it's most needed. What did you think of Jade's story? Rate it from 1 to 10, and let us know where you're listening from. Thank you for watching and sharing this moment with us.